Are we going to be reading the Game of Thrones? Are we going to be reading the Bible? Who knows, because they are very similar. Yes, we are starting the King's era of the Bible. We are all very excited, especially Zizi. Run the intro and let's do this. Alright, so when I was going through the Book of Kings, I was having difficulty actually I know I say this every time, but, paring it down to just one point. And I thought, just to change things up a little bit, maybe I would actually talk about multiple things that were going on in the Book of Kings and how they sort of relate to each other, because I think they do speak to a distinct narrative that is being told. So let's jump into it, and we'll start kind of where we left off, and that was with David. So last time we had Sako and some role-playing and ultra hot Bathsheba, and if you haven't watched that video, watch it now. It was actually pretty funny. And so let's pick up with David's son, Solomon. So Solomon becomes king. Most people know the story. He asked for wisdom. God's like, oh, that's pretty cool. You asked for wisdom for judging my people. And because you asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you this prosperity on unprecedented scale. It's wild how wealthy King Solomon was supposed to have been.
Money, money, money.
Supposed to have been, and I don't really like air quotes, but I did it, so deal with it. Anyway, so Solomon, he does everything. It's totally groovy. He's cool. He doesn't really do anything awful. But then he marries a lot of foreign wives, and you kind of see the problem begin early on, because it says he married the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. And I think that was maybe the first one in the Bible that it mentions he marries. Anyway.
Yes.
So another interesting little side quest that we'll take here is how the Bible, or especially early on, and I guess as we go through, we'll see if we can tie more examples into it, tends to blame women for misleading the men.
The man is the head, but the woman is the neck, and she can turn the head any way she wants.
So, easy example, Adam and Eve. Eve was the one that's blamed for seducing Adam and convincing Adam to eat of the fruit. Later on, you have the Israelites in their rambles with the Moabites. We had a whole watch-along party of that old drama of JW. And, it's the women that deceived all of the men. So now we have Solomon, the second king, and he is deceived by all of the women. I probably should have pulled this up earlier. Oh no, it's here. Yeah, so it talks about he had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives gradually inclined his heart. So just like in some of the other narratives before, it was the woman's fault. Even though it always takes two to tango and people have this autonomy where they can do as they please. But no, in the biblical narrative, especially early on, women have this force over men where they're influencing them and they're causing them to do... Here, do you not want to sit on this? Sorry. Need to remove some things from Zizi's bed. Anyway, so because of the women, that's why Solomon started setting up these high places and going against the worship of Jehovah. So you have an open apostasy, right? He's not following Jehovah anymore, but he's kind of doing his own thing. So what's the punishment for that? Well, as we know in the biblical narrative, oftentimes it's not, depending on who you are, it's not you who will be punished, but it is your son. There's only one named son of Solomon in the Bible, and that is Rehoboam. So after Solomon dies, Rehoboam ascends to the throne. He tries to put himself not in Jerusalem, where most kings were anointed, but he goes to Shechem, I believe, in order that he can try and bring in all of the houses and the families and the tribes of Israel together. It doesn't really go too well because there's a prophecy already in place because of what his father did. So he tried to make an effort to say, oh, well, maybe I can do this thing in order to try and bring everyone together. But God was pulling the strings the whole time. So let me kind of explain what that was going on. So the prophecy basically said, Solomon, your son is going to not be able to rule over all of Israel, but I will give him one tribe. And so he was basically able to rule over Judah and parts of Benjamin. And none of this was up to Rehoboam, by the way. And I guess we'll just kind of move ahead to that point. So in 1 Kings 12, we have the story where Rehoboam is trying to figure out how he's going to handle this request. So because he had his coronation in Shechem, the people went up to him and said, Solomon was getting kind of rough for us. He
That's what she said.
was very oppressive, and he made our yoke, hard and heavy.
That's what she said.
Can you lighten it for us? I assume it's like forced labor and taxes, right? So first off, he goes and consults with the older men, and the older men tell him, oh, well, what you should do is just try and make it a little bit easier for the people, ingratiate yourself, try and be more pleasant, and people will follow you. So he's like, oh, okay, old guys, piss off.
I ain't going to battle with this stinky old man.
I think you need to learn some manners.
I'm going to get my pals. So he gets all of his young friends and everything, and they say, yo, you got to intimidate all the people. So tell him, if I forget the phrase it uses, but it's something like, if Solomon's yoke was the size of a finger, my yoke will be the size of a waist or a thigh or something like that. So
That's what she said.
basically, he's like, I'm going to make it even more difficult. And so he listened to his young cronies. But the interesting part, and it's funny because a lot of the Christian apologetics and the Jehovah's Witnesses fall right into this camp, basically using this as a lesson of, you should listen to the wise old men and not listen to the accounts or wow, why can't I think of English words today? You shouldn't listen to the counsel of, these young men who are your friends. But the interesting part of this is, if we go down to, we're in chapter 12 and verse 15, it says, so the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was caused by Jehovah, in order to carry out the word Jehovah had spoken through Ahijah, which is the one that made the prophecy to Solomon. And then scrolling down a little bit more, Rehoboam then is met with a prophet of the true God and basically tells him, hey, you're done. Why don't you just go home? And Rehoboam's like, okay. So he's just like, well, I'm not going to fight this. I'm just going to go along with it. And so he went and built, established himself, basically as the king of Judah and Benjamin. So that he was like, okay, well, I can't do anything to fight against God. I may as well go along with it. So the interesting part here is how no one has any control over what's going on. It says specifically twice in the account that God is the one that is causing all of this to happen. Rehoboam doesn't have a choice in the matter. He's just a pawn, being moved by the chess master. And it kind of goes in an affront to what people claim is free will, which is one problem. And then also, if people can't actually, do something right or do something wrong, what's the point of it? If it's all been prescribed already, then you may as well just sit back and wait for whatever happens. It's a very bizarre way to read this, but you have to take into account like these very specific times in the Bible where it says, well, God is the one that's causing this to happen. So what are you going to do? You just have to be along for the ride. And then you can always cross-reference Romans 9, which solidifies the entire point. So then, moving right along, we move to Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam was God's chosen one that was going to take over the other tribes of Israel that weren't left to the house of David, namely Solomon, then Rehoboam. So Jeroboam, he was not a person of noble birth, but someone that stood out and was appointed to command parts of the army or the chariots or something. I can't remember exactly. And basically, he is God's chosen one. So it's like, by the word of Jehovah, you are going to be the king. But what does this chosen one of Jehovah do? Well, he doesn't do as Jehovah asks. And now we're going to have a quick pattern here. But a little side quest that we'll take is having to do with this bizarre account that happens with Jeroboam when one of his sons gets sick. So Jeroboam, he has a son that gets sick, and he's like, oh no, let's now, because something bad's happening, let's go to Jehovah and see, or to one of the prophets of Jehovah, and see if he can't help. So he didn't want, because he knew he was doing what was bad, he didn't want to, go there himself, so he sent his wife basically in a disguise. Jehovah tells the prophet what's, the plan or the plot that's going on beforehand, and basically says, hey, call them out on this. So when the wife arrives, the prophet just lays in and says, listen to the word of Jehovah. Your entire house is going to be completely ruined. It's going to just be, just completely wrecked, wiped out from the face of the earth. I guess I can read you some of the language here. But you have done worse than all that were prior to you, and you offended me by making your metal gods. For this reason I am bringing calamity on the house of Jeroboam, and I will annihilate from Jeroboam every male, including the helpless and the weak in Israel. I will make a clean sweep of the house of Jeroboam, just as one clears away the dung until it is all gone. Anyone belonging to Jeroboam who dies in the city, the dogs will eat, and anyone who dies in the fields, the birds of the heavens will eat, for Jehovah has spoken it. Now here's the really interesting part, or not interesting, but horrible. Now rise up, go to your house. When you set foot in the city, the child will die. All Israel will mourn him and bury him, for he alone of Jeroboam's family will be laid in a grave, because he is the only one of the house of Jeroboam in whom Jehovah the God of Israel has found something good. So, of all of Jeroboam's house, there's this one child that Jehovah likes. But as soon as the wife goes back to her house, the one person that Jehovah likes, he is going to kill immediately there on the spot, and he'll have a proper burial. I'll repeat that. The one person that Jehovah likes of the house of Jeroboam, Jehovah kills immediately as soon as the wife. And then later on it says, the wife comes home, as soon as she steps foot on the threshing floor, the son immediately dies. And then the rest of them will die eventually. So
that seems reasonable.
So now our side quest is over. We're going to come back to the main story. So here's the pattern. So remember, Jeroboam was the chosen one of God. He immediately rebelled. And then God's like, okay, I'm going to wipe out your whole family. So then later on, God raises up this other guy, Baasha, to wipe out all of the house of Jeroboam. And he successfully does. Well, what does Baasha do? He immediately disobeys God. And then what does God say? Well, I'm going to wipe out your entire house. And then the person that God chooses, so then it's his son again. So Baasha's son, Elha, he becomes king. And then while he's out and getting completely shit-faced and drunk, the leader of his chariots, the Dothraki, I think they were called, struck him down. And this guy's name was Zimri. And Zimri killed not only all of Elha's, who was Baasha's son, but he killed all of the family, but he also killed all of his friends as well. Well, this guy was a real piece of work, and he only was on the throne for 7 days. And this sort of schism broke out where people were trying to choose between Omri, who was the chief of the army, and this other guy named Tibni, who I don't really know. But anyway, so Zimri, the leader of the Dothraki chariot force, after he had ruled for an entire 7 days, and Omri came into the city and took it over, he was like, well, I'm not going to win this battle. So he went into the king's house and burned the whole house down with himself inside of it. So that was cool. And then we get to Omri, who he battles with this other guy named Tibni, and then after a while Tibni loses because he's weak, and Omri is the king. See, it is Game of Thrones basically. But anyway, I go down this whole rabbit hole because I find it really fascinating when you read these stories that you have this, God chooses someone, they immediately rebel against him, and then God wipes out their entire house. So all of the sons are paying for the sins of the father. And when you think back to this whole period, starting with David, David sinned. According to the law, he should have been put to death, but he got a get out of jail free card. And who paid for it? His son. Solomon, he went against Jehovah, and who was the one that paid for it? Well, I'm not going to punish you, I'm going to punish your son, Rehoboam. So Rehoboam isn't able to, bring all of the kingdoms together, so he only has this one tribe, but then it also became 2 tribes. It's kind of confusing because it says, I'm going to give you 1 tribe, but then it talks about him being over the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. Anyway, a little bit goofy. So you have the son getting paid or paying the price for the father. Then you go down this line of Jeroboam. He's the chosen one. He disobeys God. What happens? Well, God raises up this other guy, Baasha. He wipes out the house. He disobeys God. Then he raises up someone else. Immediately disobeys God. And you think, why doesn't God just pick someone that's better? If he is omniscient and knows everything and can read people's hearts, why doesn't he just pick a better ruler? That way he doesn't have to keep wiping out families over and over and over again. It really makes no sense to me whatsoever. Now, a funny thing that happens, and I guess this will be the last side quest of the day, is this funny thing that happens between 2 prophets of Jehovah in Kings 13. So you have this one prophet that comes to Jeroboam and basically tells him, it's all over for you, bud. You should have done better, bucko. And this guy has like some crazy superpowers because Jeroboam's like sees that man, and as soon as they go to seize him, like the guy's arms get immediate arthritis and just lock into place and freeze, and they can't touch him. So he's got like some super suit or something. And then the altar falls apart in ashes and some stuff happen. And then Jeroboam's like, oh my goodness, this is clearly you're a spokespersons for God. Why don't you come and have dinner with me? That way you can plead to Jehovah for me. And the guy says, no, Jehovah said I'm to deliver the message and then go back home, but not in the way that I came, and I can't eat or drink. So then he gets on the road, and this other prophet of Jehovah comes along and says, hey, why don't you come and have dinner with me? You might be kind of hungry. And the first guy says, well, no, God said that I'm not to eat or drink. But the other prophet's like, well, an angel of God came and told me that you should. So he agrees. He's like, well, I guess I'll go along if an angel of God told you to do so. So then he comes and he eats and he drinks. He leaves the older prophet's house to go back to his, and a lion comes and rips him apart, leaves his carcass by the side of the road, and then stands there like a sentinel and basically says, well, no one's going to touch this dead body. And so this lion is standing next to this dead body as people are walking along the road and, talking about it in the city. And he doesn't eat the donkey, he doesn't eat the passerbyers, and he doesn't eat the corpse. He's just standing there keeping guard of it. Oh boy, big yawn. So then the first prophet gets word about this, or the older prophet, not the first, the older prophet gets word about this, and he feels really bad. He's like, oh no, this guy died? That's horrible. So he goes and picks up his dead corpse, brings him back to his house, and mourns with his sons for a while. And then he tells his sons, I want to be buried with this guy. I think at some point he even calls him my brother. And I find this story really fascinating because you have this case where, both of these guys are prophets of God, and God speaks to both of them in the story. So I don't know the exact rules of engagement here, but I assume that you must have some sort of connection with God if he's actively speaking to you. And so both of them are prophets of God. And then the one difference is you have the older prophet that came and said, oh, well, an angel of God came and told me that you should come and eat and drink. And in my mind, this is more evidence of the narrative of Satan being the accuser. So throughout the Bible, you have these instances where Satan's function is basically to go and test. He's working for God. God sends him out to test people. So when it talks about an angel told me to say this, it is conceivable in my mind that this is, the Satan of the Old Testament, who is just an accuser. And I guess we'll talk more about this when we get into Chronicles and when we get into Job, which will be really interesting as well. But I just wanted to bring up that story because I found it interesting, and it kind of starts to lay the groundwork of Satan being the accuser as we go along through more of these chapters in the Bible. The kings, they're so fascinating and so interesting, and it is crazy to see just like how back and forth and up and down everything. But the one thing being consistent is that God can never seem to pick a good ruler until Asa comes along and he likes him. One other note is that Omri, the king that we left off on, he was the first, if I'm not mistaken, he is the first king of Israel that we have extra biblical sources for. And I believe it's from the Moabite stone, where it talks about the king Omri oppressing the Moabites and basically ruling over that people. So now we're actually getting into the section of the Bible that we can start verifying things with extra sources through different, anyway, we'll get into that more later on in our adventures of Bible reading. But yeah, a lot happens here. We get the kings, we get the Game of Thrones narrative, we get the first verifiable king, I think is the first verifiable, don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure, of an extra biblical source. And we also get this bizarre story of the prophets of God being given different messages, but one was being told it directly from Jehovah, the other was being told by an angel of Jehovah, which helps kind of add evidence to, Satan being the accuser. I know I kept summing things up, but it's a little bit fast, it's a little bit dense, so I just wanted to make sure that everyone sort of got the whole story, and it was completely clear. Thank you so much for joining me on another Bible Reading with Wally, and we will see you next time.